Morning, everyone. We are in, we're in 1 Kings chapter 5 through 8 this morning. It's good to see each and every one of you, and looking forward to our study this morning. This is the section where we're going to have the preparation for the temple, but also the building and constructing of it, and the temple furnishings, and then ultimately the dedication that Solomon's going to pray. He's going to bless Yahweh. He's going to bless the people. He's going to pray to Yahweh. Yahweh is going to bless their efforts, and the house that he is going to dwell in will be a place for Jerusalem or for Israel to come and be in his presence. There are a lot of connections that I want to make this morning that have to do with the temple and other parts of the Bible, specifically the Torah. I think you'll find as you read through, you'll see some that are on the surface, some that are just obvious, some that are maybe not so obvious. You got to really pull it out. But just some interesting things that I really want us to focus on, and really what I would say are theological connections, not so much historical connections. I mean, there obviously are a lot of historical connections in the text, but more so, I like how one author put it, a connection that is a reminder, so that the reader, as the reader is reading these texts, these passages, they're being reminded of things that God has already accomplished or promised or prophesied, or which will point forward to something that's going to be realized or fulfilled in the future, and helps to kind of make a contrast for the reader. So we're going to see a lot of those things. Some of them are neat little connections, like, for example, you have in 1 Kings chapter 7 where Solomon's going to hire Hiram, not the king, a different Hiram, who is going to come, and the text says in 1 Kings chapter 7 that he was a worker in bronze, and he was filled with wisdom and discernment and knowledge to do any work in bronze. You might recall that when the tent of meeting or the tabernacle was being constructed, that all the way back in the book of Exodus, that God had called Bezalel and Aholiab, men who were going to be workers in bronze. And this is what it says in Exodus chapter 31, verse 3, "And I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and discernment and knowledge." You have those three things again. "And in all kinds of craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs for work in gold and silver and in bronze." So when the tabernacle was being built, God miraculously, through the Spirit, filled these men with the wisdom, knowledge, discernment to be able to make these furnishings, make all the decorations, anything that had to do with the craftsmanship of the tent. Well, you fast forward to the temple, and I don't know if in 1 Kings if Hiram is not said that he is miraculously filled, but he is filled nonetheless with wisdom and discernment and knowledge to be able to do this craftsmanship. And so you see there's connections like that, where there's going to be things within the text that ought to remind us of, hey, this is reminding me of the tabernacle, or this is reminding me of the exile, things like that. So just be paying attention to that as you read through this section. This section is not just a list of measurements. It's not just a list of, okay, what furniture was in the temple. Okay, that's neat. Thanks for the information, author. No, they are reminders. So, and they're contrasts. So, for example, you have where he lays out all the measurements and the beauty and the furnishings and all of the utensils, and he lays all that out. He spells it out for the reader. It's this long list. But then when you get to 1 Kings chapter 9, look there with me, 1 Kings chapter 9, and in verse 6. 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 6 says, "But if you or your sons indeed turn away from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have given before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, Then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have set apart as holy for my name. I will cast out of my presence, so Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And notice this, and this house will become a heap of ruins. So all the measurements, all the utensils, all the furnishings, all the beauty and the glory and the different materials that were used, all of that was recorded for a reason. It will become a heap of ruins. Everyone who passes by will feel desolate and hiss and say, why has Yahweh done thus to this land and to this house? And they will say, because they forsook Yahweh their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and took hold of other gods and worshipped them and served them. Therefore Yahweh has brought all this calamity on them. It is necessary in the very beginning, just a second, Kevin, it is necessary in the very beginning of Kings to lay all of this out. And the reason being is, if you'll recall, Kings was not two books. In the original Hebrew Bible, it is one book. And so laying all this out, all this construction in the very beginning of Kings helps contrast, helps set a reminder for what's coming, what the other book end is going to be. So in 2 Kings, if you'll turn there with me to 2 Kings, and what you're going to find is there's going to be that contrast. 2 Kings, let's look at chapter 17 to start with, chapter 17. There's going to be that contrast between everything that we have been reading about in chapters 5 through 8 is now going to be contrasted with the end here. So 2 Kings chapter 17, so Yahweh, verse 18, so Yahweh was very angry with Israel and caused them to depart from his presence. None was left except the tribe of Judah alone. All right, so there's a lot in chapters 5 through 8 about the presence of God. That is what the temple, that was one of the purposes of the temple, was to show that his presence is with Israel, that he is dwelling among his people. His people are dwelling with him. Also, verse 19, Judah did not keep the commandments of Yahweh their God, but walked in the statutes which Israel had made. So Yahweh rejected all the seed of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers. Now, those plunderers were those who plundered all of the things within the temple until he had cast them from his presence. He had torn Israel from the house of David, and you keep going on. It talks about the sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam until, verse 23, until Yahweh calls Israel to depart from his presence. So he spoke through all his slaves, the prophets. So Israel went into exile from their own land to Assyria until this day. This was Israel, and then you have the Judah, who is later going to go into Babylonian captivity. Then in chapter 24, 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 13, it says, 24 verse 13, and he brought out from there all the treasuries of the house of Yahweh. Okay, we've read all that in chapters 5 through 8. And the treasuries of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon king of Israel had made in the temple of Yahweh, just as Yahweh had spoken. Then in chapter 25, and this is really the majority of the chapter, but we're going to skip a lot of it here. Verse 9, chapter 25, verse 9, and he burned the house of Yahweh. Okay, we just read 7 years it took to build this temple. All of the construction, all of the laborers, the thousands of people involved in building this dwelling place for Yahweh. And at the end of Kings, it is burned just like that. It is plundered. It is destroyed. It is, as 1 Kings chapter 9 says, it is a heap of ruins. The king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem, even every great house he burned with fire. He tore down the walls, verse 10, around Jerusalem. And you go on, verse 13, now the bronze pillars which were in the house of Yahweh, and the stands and the bronze sea which were in the house of Yahweh, the Chaldeans shattered and carried the bronze to Babylon. Again, I just think it's important to be a broken record here and emphasize this, because I think sometimes when it comes to biblical text, maybe when it comes to the genealogies, oh, there's just a list of names. Let's skip through it real quick, and we're going to have some things to say about that when we get to Chronicles. But I think we get to these texts and we're like, oh, all these measurements and all of this, what is the purpose of this? Why is this all recorded? How does this apply to me? It's right here. It's showing that God keeps his promises. He is faithful even to the curses that are found within the covenant. And it doesn't matter how much time you spend on the construction of this beautiful temple, it will be a great heap of ruins if you are not loyal to Yahweh. And so be looking for those contrasts, be looking for those theological reminders as you read through this text, because everything we're reading right now is setting us up for the future. It is laying the foundation, so to speak, as we move forward. Kevin, go ahead. Okay, yeah, I do like the some of the contrast there with Solomon, as it talks about how they had all this food and everything, and Solomon had rest. You do get that picture of the land flowing with milk and honey as well there. So, okay, anything else on the things that we've discussed this far? Okay, so keep that in mind. Same thing with Jeroboam's sins, which obviously Brother Matt will get into all of that as we continue chapter 12 and forward in his class, but that's all setting the stage for the exile. So just as you're reading through this, it's laying the foundation. Don't read too fast over these things. There is another thing too that I think is interesting as we're talking about just the overview of chapters 5 through 8 and the things that are accomplished and the prayers that are prayed and the speeches that Solomon gives. He's going to do a lot of connecting to the covenant of David over and over again. He's going to make that connection of, hey, this is happening because of the promise you made to my father David. He's going to say that to Yahweh. He's going to say that to the people. And I think it's like 4 or 5 times he brings that up within this text. That Solomon is doing this based on faith in Yahweh, that he is going to fulfill these things. And I think it's interesting when it comes to Solomon's speeches and his prayer, how he builds his speeches based on his knowledge of Yahweh, but on his knowledge of the Torah and Israel's history. So he's going to refer a lot to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. As you break down his words, his prayer, a lot of his words find some kind of root in the Torah, and so he knew the Torah well. I think about Deuteronomy chapter 17 that says that each of the kings was to write out the Torah for themselves, have their own copy. They were to read it, meditate on it, and learn to fear God. You get that picture of Solomon here in this section as he is leaning on the Torah in his speeches and prayer. Along that line, something that I think helps to set up the future as well, and that is in his prayer, he is going to focus on foreigners. Now, we know the attitudes of the first century Jews. When you get to the New Testament, you have this attitude of, oh, they're the Gentiles, they're the dogs, don't touch me. You've got Matthew 15, they leave the marketplace and they're washing their hands, and they're in their minds, Gentiles are unclean. They make you unclean if you rub shoulders with them, the whole 9 yards. So there is this attitude against Gentiles. Obviously, Jesus comes on the scene. He begins to break all that down when he heals Gentiles and when he communicates with them and things like that. in Solomon's prayer, in this section, we learn that this temple was not just merely for the house, for the house of Israel and house of Judah, but for Israel as a whole. It wasn't just for Israel; it was for all peoples. If you remember the mission of the people of Israel, from the very beginning when they were called out of Egypt, they were to be a kingdom of priests. They were to be a kingdom that put Yahweh on display. And as they obeyed the commandments of Moses, that was them bearing the image of God. They were going to be holy like he is holy. And when you get to passages like Deuteronomy chapter 4, where he says that all these nations are going to see your wisdom and your understanding, and they're going to then praise your God of, that God has, is powerful and wise, and just look at his people. So they were to be drawing all nations to Yahweh by their behavior, by their obedience. So when we get to Isaiah, for example, if you'll turn there with me, Isaiah chapter 49. This helps us make sense of some of those prophetic texts. Isaiah chapter 49, he says, it is, verse 6, Isaiah 49, verse 6, he says, "It is too small a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to cause the preserved ones of Israel to return. I will also give you as a light of the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." So part of Israel's mission was to bring Yahweh to all of the earth. I think about how God told Adam and Eve to go forth and multiply and fill the earth. And the idea was to fill the earth with his image. They were to be image bearers. Well, Israel was to go and fill the earth with the image of Yahweh. And they failed in that. And obviously someone else had to come along who was the ideal Israel, who was the one who was going to and has and is filling the earth with Yahweh's name, and that is Jesus. And if you remember in John chapter 8, he says, "I am the light of the world." Well, Israel was supposed to be the light of the nations. Obviously, they failed in that because of their idolatry and their covenant disobedience. So you have this going on where they were to be a light to the nations. And then in Isaiah chapter 56, Isaiah 56, and I want to read this 56 verse 1 through 8 here. Yahweh says, "Keep justice and do righteousness, for my salvation is about to come and my righteousness to be revealed." And the idea about salvation, remember from chapter 49, it said that the salvation will reach the ends of the earth. Think about Acts chapter 2, that salvation is going to go to the ends of the earth because of the gospel. "How blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who takes hold of it, who keeps from profaning the Sabbath and keeps his hand from doing any evil. Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to Yahweh say, Yahweh will surely separate me from his people. Nor let the eunuch say, Behold, I am a dry tree." And think about the eunuch in Acts chapter 8. "For thus says Yahweh, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths and choose what pleases me and holds fast my covenant, to them I will give in my house, within my walls, a memorial and a name better than that of the sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name which will not be cut off. And also the foreigners who join themselves to Yahweh, to minister to him and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his slaves, every one who keeps from profaning the Sabbath and takes hold of my covenant, even those I will bring to my holy mountain and make them glad in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all the peoples. Lord Yahweh, who gathers the banished of Israel, declares, Yet others I will gather to them, to those already gathered." A lot of these passages are not a lot. These passages are pointing forward to the New Testament, where we see a lot of things like Jesus cleansing the temple, and my Father's house is a house of prayer, and the idea is it's for all people. And then Jesus is going to gather, he talks about that, that he didn't just come for Israel, but to gather all nations. But you'll notice how in Isaiah, God is talking about how the foreigner is acceptable to him if the foreigner converts and is loyal to Yahweh. You get that here in 1 Kings chapters 5 through 8. Solomon, as he is praying, he prays for the foreigner who turns to God, the foreigner who is loyal to God, who keeps covenant with God. He is going to be accepted by God. And so when we're talking about the house of Yahweh here, the temple, it was not just a place for Israel. It was a place for all peoples. And that has a little bit of hint to the Abrahamic covenant, where all peoples, all nations will be blessed through the seed of Abraham. So I say all that to say this, that the temple, there is this, the purpose of the temple is obviously this meeting place between God and man. It is where God can commune with man because they are going to the temple to worship him, to have atonement for their sins because of separation due to sin. So obviously that temple, that sacrificial system was put in place to forgive them of their sins, to help them come back into the presence of God. But it wasn't just Israel who needed salvation. It was the ends of the earth that needed salvation. And so there are many ways in which Israel abused the temple, and there are many ways in which Israel did not fulfill the purpose of the temple. And that was, or just the nation as in general, and that was to be a light to all the nations. Questions or comments on that? Okay. One other thing I want to talk about as far as connections with the temple to help us just to appreciate everything that the author here is recording for us. And that is, we've talked about how the temple is, we're coming into the presence of God. Again, it's that meeting place between God and man where they are reconciled because of sacrifice. And obviously, that should all point forward to Jesus, who, if we have time, I'll do a lesson on that or bring in some of that, where Jesus is the temple. We are, as Peter says, the living stones that make up the house of God. And so we can say some things about that. But while you have that future connection to this sacrificial system, you also have the past, going all the way back to Genesis. So you might recall God created the heavens and the earth in 7 days. Well, the temple was created or built in 7 years. Interestingly enough, when Solomon goes to dedicate the temple, they're going to dedicate it during the Feast of Booths, which lasted 7 days. And so there's a lot of sevens there in the text, I think, that is symbolic. So you have this connection to the creation. And then you have just the idea of the temple. Again, man has fallen, man has sinned, man is separated from God, therefore man has to be brought back into his presence. That ought to remind us of the Garden of Eden, where was a place of paradise. It was a place of perfect communion with God, fellowship with God. God was walking around in the garden. He was dwelling with his creation, Adam and Eve. All of that ought to be reminding us of the temple, because all of those things are generally said or referred to with the idea of the temple as well. You have, within the temple, you have all of these carvings. And what are the carvings? They're of trees, palm trees, they're flowers, they're cherubim. And you get this idea of a lush garden throughout the temple. Then, if you remember, once man sinned in the garden, then there was the consequence of sin. They were banished, so exile. They were banished from the presence of God, and they moved eastward. And cherubim was put up in the garden to guard from anyone coming up to the tree of life. And interestingly enough, in the temple, there are 15-foot tall cherubim that are spread out, and they are, it seems, guarding the Ark of the Covenant, the meeting place, so to speak, of God. And so you have Adam and Eve who are banished, and then what does God do? He covers their sin with animal skin. He atones. There's that picture of sacrifice because he kills animals to cover them after they have sinned. And in the temple, there's a lot of covering for sin that's taking place, and there's a lot of atonement for sin that is taking place. So pay attention to those connections. And we don't have time to deal with all of them. There are some more, but maybe think on that yourself as you read through this text of what God and man had in the garden, God and man can have with this sacrificial system. Not in a perfect sense. We cannot have that in a perfect sense until we get to Jesus, where we can perfectly come into the presence of God because our sins are taken away and removed and forgotten. We don't have to have that yearly reminder of sin like they did under the priestly or the priesthood in the book of Leviticus. So there's just a lot of neat connections there between sin, atonement, and the presence of God. Okay, let's get into the text a little bit. I know we did a lot of things outside of the text, but I just wanted y'all to see those connections as you're moving through. And 3 to 4 sentences summarize chapters 5 through 8. And if you'd like to add, how did these stories or how do these things connect to the exile?
Very simply, Solomon builds the temple. God puts his name there. He demonstrates it by filling it with his glory the same way he did the tabernacle.
Yep, so another connection there. All right. Anyone else? I liked what this one author said here. Each new generation must choose to follow the Lord. Abraham, Moses, Joshua, and David have shown Solomon and his subjects how to obey the Lord, but they must now follow their ancestors' example. And you really see that here in this text, especially with the prayers and the speeches that Solomon has. Going all the way back to chapter 6. If you'll turn there with me, chapter 6 and verse 11, it says, the word of Yahweh came to Solomon. Chapter 6, verse 11, the word of Yahweh came to Solomon saying, concerning this house which you are building, if you will walk in my statutes and do my judgments and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell among the sons of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. Solomon and the people of Israel had to learn that lesson, just like all their forefathers had to learn it as well. Okay, what conditions in Israel made it possible for Solomon to build the temple? And why do you think that's important that we get those highlights of the conditions in Israel? You opened your mouth. Yeah, go ahead.
They had incredible wealth. Gold was as common as rocks, it says in a couple of places. So if ever there was a place that was going to be able to put as much gold into a building, that place was it. And they had peace, so they didn't have to use all the labor for armies. They could use all the labor for labor.
Yeah, I do like the mention of all the different materials. Interestingly enough, in the garden, some of those materials are mentioned as well, of it being in abundance. And then here you've got that picture of those special materials in abundance. But yeah, you're talking about peace. 1 Kings chapter 5 says, you know that David my father was unable, and this is Solomon speaking to Hiram, the king of Tyre, to build a house for the name of Yahweh his God because of the wars which surrounded him, until Yahweh put them under the soles of his feet. But now Yahweh my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor calamity. And so Solomon took that as, it's time. It's time to build the temple. Let's get to work and let's do this. And so you've got no threats that are going to hinder the project. And you've got that stability, you've got the abundant resources, and so on. As far as the workers are concerned, Kevin had brought that up. How many workers were involved? Do you remember from the text? Okay. And they were just constantly working, around the clock here. And that shows what?
I need to look it up. I didn't find the reference yesterday, but somewhere it says that all of those forced laborers, none of them were Israelites. So that it shows a couple of things. Number one, we still have a pretty sizable presence of non-Israelites in the land. So on one hand, that's a failure. On the other hand, they are being subject to forced labor. So Israel has complete dominance over them. Should they have wiped them out? Yes. Do they have dominance? Well, I suppose that's perhaps a distant second sort of thing. And from that, it dawns on me another thing that we could throw into the conditions that allowed for Solomon to start construction. We really have two great generations in Israel. You have Joshua's generation, and you have David's generation. Joshua, because he led a faithful people in battle, was able to provide a certain amount of peace for rest, as far from Hebrews, for the generation that followed. David, because he led a faithful people to conquer his enemies, was able to provide a certain amount of peace. So they only had this peace because you had a man of blood in the generation prior and people who faithfully followed him.
Yeah. I think you were talking about 1 Kings chapter 9, where it talks about the non-Israelites. That's what you were looking for there. You've got this temple that is, it's interesting how, I'm about to say the temple was massive, and it was, in all its glory, and it took a national effort and everything, but at the same time, it's not as big as you would imagine it, or at least in my mind, would imagine it to be. But it did, with all of the stone, all of the woodwork, everything that was involved in it. It took Israel doing it. It took him going to making a covenant with Hiram, the king of Tyre, to provide a lot of the materials that was needed for the project. It would have been something beautiful to see. Obviously, we know it was destroyed, and King Herod is going to build the second. It's going to be bigger, and you think about something Stephen had mentioned one time in it was a Bible study. I think it was a preacher's study in Illinois. I think he made this point. You take the glory and the beauty of what we're reading about in Scripture about this temple, and it's not down here and like we're contrasting it. No, it's way up here. And then when you come to the New Testament and you have the New Jerusalem and the New Temple, as beautiful as Solomon's temple was, there's so much more beauty found within Jesus. And so let us appreciate the physical aspect of this temple, this house of God, and it will help us then to appreciate the spiritual house of God. The people, God's people make up his house. Okay. As far as the description of Solomon's temple in all its glory, I would refer you to the Bible. That's the best way to read, and because God is the only one that can really, truly describe it for us. But I do want to talk about this question here. How did God show his approval for this place of worship? Brad already mentioned that God's glory filled the temple just like it did in the tabernacle. In Chronicles, I will bring in Chronicles for a moment, it says fire came down and consumed the offering that Solomon had made. It reminded me back all the way in Leviticus chapter 9 when he goes through all these commandments for the new priesthood. Chapter 9, verse 24, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the offering. It showed divine acceptance of the priesthood, of their sacrifices, of their holiness. Then, obviously, in chapter 10, God strikes down Nadab and Abihu because they do something that is unauthorized. But the idea is that when fire comes down and consumes the offering, it is a divine acceptance of this. And then in chapter 9, the Lord is going to say, I have consecrated this place, this temple. So he does approve of everything that Solomon has done. And it's what is significant about the time marker here in this text of he is now in his 4th year, he's building this temple, is it's showing not only the faithfulness of God and that the promises are coming true, but also you have those connections to Deuteronomy, like chapter 12, where there's going to be a place that he's going to dwell, he's going to have his name, there's going to be that central place of worship. That's all coming to fruition. They've been moving around in tents, but now there's going to be more of a permanency here with the temple and with Jerusalem being that place where God is going to dwell. But there is a lesson we need to learn, that the exiles need to learn as well, and that is Solomon did not believe that Yahweh's presence was just bound to the temple or within the temple walls. And he says as much in 1 Kings chapter 8. Turn there with me in verse 27. He says, but will God truly dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built? For the exiles who are in a foreign land, the temple, the altar, all of that has been destroyed, it has been burned, it is a heap of ruins. How do we come in contact with God? How do we commune with Him? How are we restored? Solomon says he doesn't dwell in temples made with human hands. You can, in that foreign land, you can pray to God, you can repent, and you can be delivered from the situation that you find yourself in. He will hear you outside of these walls. Israel needed that. They needed that encouragement. They needed that hope because he's going to say that. He's going to anticipate the exile in his prayer. When these people sin against you and when they repent, hear them from the land that they are in. So this is important for those initial readers or those original readers of this text of our temple is in ruins before us. All right. What is the purpose of the temple? We've already mentioned a lot of that, but I wanted to leave off with this right here. Obviously, you have this. It's a place of prayer and intercession and the sacrificial system and a place of forgiveness and where God and man meet and are reconciled. But I really liked this quote, and I wanted to leave with this. Here, the unapproachable Lord becomes approachable and ready to help those who worship, sacrifice, and pray. In the New Testament, we learn, as well as in the Old, but we learn that God, because of our sin, we cannot approach Him. And God is reaching out with this temple, with the tabernacle even. He's reaching out to His people, and He's saying, do you want to approach me? Here's how it's done. It is through worship and sacrifice and loyalty. And so an unapproachable God is making Himself approachable to His people. All right, thank you.